Mr. Erik Wiese.
Well, that's
15 minutes. Thank you, sir.
The Spartans were well known for their economy of speech and also for their military success on land. And so when Philip II, around 350 BC, threatened an invasion of Sparta, he sent down to them an ultimatum and a demand. He said, if I enter your lands, I'm going to free your slaves, burn your crops, rape your women, hopefully not the men.
Could be both.
Well,
They were mean.
and kill all of your children. And the person who was in charge, the king down in Sparta, said, if, sent that back as the response, if you enter our lands. So this was legendary as the economy of words. Now, he didn't learn his lesson, so a little bit later, Philip II then sent a second ultimatum down. And he said, I'm either going to come as a friend or a foe. Which would you like? And the king responded, neither. So they got in the habit of these types of sayings. I'm going to talk to you about a gentleman who was a general, who was an Athenian general. His name was Alcibiades. And he actually served, he was born about 450 BC and he lived to about 404 BC. And this was right during the Peloponnesian War. And the Peloponnesian War is a conflict between Sparta and Athens. And as our introduction talked about, Athens is viewed through history as being maybe a progenitor of America. They were a sea power. They had a Delian League. They had a number of allies, and they were pretty much indomitable on sea. And many of you are familiar with the movie 300. And the Spartans went up in 480 BC, and in the Battle of Thermopylae, technically they lost, but they delayed Xerxes and inflicted a lot of damage on him over a 10-day period of time. And this gave the Athenians the ability to get their mobilization and the Spartans to mobilize for the Battle of Marathon, where they beat the Persians, and the Battle of Salamis, where they beat the Persians on the water. And this drove Xerxes back into Persia where he belonged. Xerxes got his comeuppance after being drubbed in the Battle of Salamis and the Battle of Marathon, and the Battle of Plateau, which took place about 40 years later when he decided to come down and try it again. So what I would like to talk about, though, is now after they got rid of their chief nemesis, which was Persia, Athens and Sparta decided to go after each other. And they were vicious. They hated each other. And what Athens did to protect itself from Sparta is they developed these long walls. And they had a port, which is down near Piraeus, and then they had their city, which was a couple miles distance. And they actually put together walls that went all the way from their port, all the way up to their city, and all the way around it. And whenever the Spartans invaded, they would all retreat back to their walled city. And they were inside this area, fairly impregnable, but you say, where'd they get all of their food? They got it from their port. They would go out with the ships that they were very successful in having a fleet that nobody could dominate, and they would extract concessions from all of their friends and allies in order to get the grain that they needed to survive. And meanwhile, Sparta, like most armies at the time, would come out after harvest, burn down all the harvest of their neighbors, try and engage in combat, but then have to go back and harvest their own food. And so wars were fought in a season. There was a war season. And then everyone sort of left home, left a little holding force there to do not much more than be scouts. So when you start looking at these battles, there's a lot of things that you can learn. And in this book, Tides of War by Steven Pressfield, he has taken historical fiction and put in a lot of what I think are practical principles of running an army. And I'd like to go over some of those, because when I read this, I read it not only for the historical value, not only to contrast the Spartans versus the Athenians, but also to see what you as a commander can actually do to try and get your troops to win. So let me go over some of the points that are brought out in this story. How does one lead free men? By being better than they. A commander's role is to model Erik, excellence, before his men. When he not thrash them to greatness, only hold it out before them, they will be compelled by their own nature to emulate it. Do we know people that we respect, and we respect them not because they try and tell us how to run our lives or what to do, but simply because they show us? They are models of success. I mean, I hate to bring Trump into this, but I really like how much money he has. And you guys may not like a lot about him, but he definitely is an example of excellence when it comes to making money. Okay? Let's go on to the next point. It is not possession of force which produces victory, but its apparition. A commander of ability manipulates not armies, but perceptions. This is a critical aspect of making war. You not only have to have forces that you think can defeat the enemy, but you have to project them in a way that demoralizes the enemy. Oftentimes you will exaggerate the size of your forces. When we were invading in Normandy, for example, we let the Nazis think that we were going to invade somewhere else, so that they would move all of their people away from our actual landing sites. We exaggerated the forces that we were going to land in a place we had no intention of landing. And even when you're in battle, you often, in those days, you would build camps and you'd have extra campfires to exaggerate the size of your army, to try and get the enemy to be fearful when they came into battle. And one of the things you do whenever you were in retreat was you'd create and start all of these fires so the enemy would think you were going to stay there, and at night you'd slink away in order to prevent being drubbed in the morning. So deception and creating forces that look to be greater than they are is part of keeping the morale of your own troops up and demoralizing the enemy. What else can we talk about? As for Alcibiades himself, the allure of the debauch had abated. One of the problems with Alcibiades is he likes women, and not just his wife. He likes lots of women, and even his lieutenant's wives and his lieutenant's girlfriends. He, in fact, can't stop himself. And this ends up hurting his ability to function, and inevitably leads to his comeuppance, where he is thrown out of Athens, and then he's thrown out of Sparta, and then he goes and joins the Persian army, and eventually gets thrown out of Persia also. And where have we seen other leaders who have moral problems that prevent them from fulfilling their destiny? Well, to be even-handed, so Mr. Comeau doesn't storm out of here or start throwing things at me, we did have Richard Nixon, who was paranoid at what the Democrats might be doing, and that paranoia allowed him to authorize something that was illegal, and then he didn't engage in obstruction of justice as well as the Clintons did, who engaged in perjury in addition to obstruction of justice, and perhaps even raping some of the women that he had lied under oath about. So neither one of those two leaders of ours was able to do what they wanted to because of personal failings and their inability to control themselves. Okay, let's go down and see what else. He talks about how, as running the army, he wants to be frugal. And isn't that interesting? Armies are run by money. You have to have money, you have to have weapons, you have to have men, you have to have good leadership. If you don't have money, you have nobody who wants to work for you. They all quit. They go join the enemy, or they decide to go home. And what are we doing today in America? We have a $20 trillion deficit with no end in sight that keeps going up and up and up. How long are we going to have the best military in the world when we are incapable of having self-control with our finances, incapable of balancing a budget? Something to learn here. Correspondence. He talks about how Alcibiades would post 100 letters a day. He was constantly trying to build alliances. And that's what any successful nation tries to do. It's called divide and conquer. You want as many friends as you can, so when you ever have to go to battle or you ever have to have a fight, you can isolate that individual that you're fighting. You try and peel off his friends and create as many of your own. We've actually done that successfully in the United Nations. We have a lot of people who look to us for leadership, and we have a lot of people that give us money or respect as long as it's cloaked in the United Nations verdict, as long as the Security Council, which we're a big part of, decides to go to war. A lot of people who otherwise wouldn't join us. That is similar to the Delian League that Athens had and to the Peloponnesian League that Sparta had. You want to congregate or get as many friends as you can and isolate your opponents through correspondence and building allies. When he wished to honor a man of the fleet, he dispatched meat or wine with his compliments to that officer's mess. Now, Dr. Paul has come and talked to us about Maslow's pyramid of needs. And there's physiological needs at the very bottom. People like food. And what better way to also give them honor is to give that food not only to the person that you want to recognize, but also to his friends and messmates. And that way he gets his own party. He gets some extra influence. It's why it's a very effective means of complimenting somebody who's done something right. And to those he wished the most self-esteem, he sent not boons but trials. He singled them out for the most perilous duties, for in these, he said, he sent out lieutenants and got back captains. Now, who would have imagined that? But there are people in the military who want self-esteem, who want self-actualization, who want to be the hero of their own private story and aren't happy on garrison duty. And you find those people and you give them a task, and it's a difficult task, and they rise to the challenge and they accomplish something they never thought they were going to accomplish, and then they get rewarded with an extra rank at the end of it. That is the epitome of leadership. And another thing he tried to do is he rarely gave orders. He would try and explain why he would do something to somebody, because he knew that if they knew why, they would be on board with it. They would buy into that decision. And they could make it happen, maybe not necessarily by the means that he wanted them to do it, by whatever means they and their expertise, them being closer to the situation, could figure out. This is a principle of federalism. In our country, each state has the right to make its own laws, and even though the federal laws trump state laws, we generally try and let the states, a hands-off approach, make most of their own decisions. And we know that the states are supposed to be hands-off for local communities. The further you get, the closest you get to an individual making decisions, the more likely the laws that are in effect at that location are going to reflect his desires. It's a principle of federalism at work. One of the reasons why America is one of the most successful countries in the world today, because we push decision-making down as far as possible, and the jurisdictions that make those decisions, we like to have the power as close as we can to the people, because people in Texas are going to make different rules than people in California. It's just the way it is and the way they want. And if you don't like the rules in your local community, you can move to Texas, or what's left of it after the recent hurricanes. He never ordered a man beaten, but only banished from his mate's company. I mean, all of you guys know if you humiliate somebody, they're less likely to want to please you. But if you simply say, you know what, I'm not inviting you to my next party until you start showing that you deserve it, they're more likely to want to try and get back into the fold. It's the principle of exile. And exile was actually used pretty effectively by the Athenians, but the biggest problem with the Athenians is that they had no constitution to prevent them from exiling some of their most famous and best people. And as a result, Socrates was faced with exile, and he ended up taking hemlock rather than leaving. So you need to have not only a democracy, but it needs to be fettered by a constitution and an independent judiciary, which is another reason why the United States can learn from Athens and learn what not to do. Contrary to the principle of minimal force was that of minimal supervision. When Alcibiades issued a combat assignment, he imparted the objective only, leaving the means to the officer himself. Exactly. You can tell somebody what to do, but it's probably better to let him figure out how to do it himself. And the people who can do that are the difference between the American soldier and the North Korean soldier. The North Korean soldier has to be told exactly what to do all the time because he knows he'll be shot if he does something wrong. The American soldier can make some mistakes and for the most part be given the autonomy to not make mistakes but to do a brilliant job most of the time. Remember, we can elevate the fleet in two ways only, by acquiring better men or making those we have better. It's difficult to get above average people throughout the entire United States, because on average, we're all average when we're all congregated together. So you have to make people better, the ones that you have in your group. And you know, there was a very successful Jack Welch at General Electric who used to bring people into his room and he'd say, you know what, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, but you did this right, and this right, and this right, and this right. And the guy got impatient and said, well, why don't you just get around to firing me? And he looked at the gentleman and said, why am I going to fire you? I figured we just lost about $60,000 to our company based on what you've done. And that is experience that you now have that we want to benefit from. We don't want you going to our competition with that experience. We expect you to learn what you can from that and stay here and make this place better. How does that sound to you? It's a principle of leadership. And another thing that good leaders have is they have the ability to make people believe in themselves. He told me I could do it, and I believed him. How many times in our own past have we looked at a mentor who has encouraged us to do something we never thought we could do, and as a result, we stepped up to the challenge? Faith is a big part of why you succeed in life. And if you don't have faith in yourself, and if other people don't have faith in you, it's hard to acquire. Good leaders promote faith in others. Now, I guess I have run to the red light, so I would like to go ahead and continue with this at a later date, but let me go ahead and tell you, Alcibiades was not known as being a great Athenian as much as he was known as leaving the Athenians to go to the Spartans, to go to the Persians, and being exiled from all of those places for his problems. But in this journey in tides of war, you learn a lot about what it takes to be a successful leader, and you can take these principles and use them in your own lives. Fellow Toastmasters.